If you are a senior leader and you come into an organization as a fractional leader, you have to roll up your sleeves. So the things that you had people that reported to you, these are things that you will be executing. You have to be a doer. Why don't we talk about what are the characteristics of a fractional contributor or leader? What are the things that you look for in a talented pool of candidates that tell you, yeah, that person is probably going to really move the needle for that organization in a fractional capacity?
So I think one thing with fractional is, to your previous point, you have an expert coming in to address a specific need. And so when you're looking at the talent pool, these are not necessarily opportunities so much for like step up. These are tried and tested experts who've done the work. So I think that is one differentiation. Whereas on a typical, career path within corporate, right, you're moving from level to level. You move from director to VP. You haven't been a VP yet, but you'll learn and grow. With the fractional piece, more so we're seeing, we need someone who's done this. So that's a lot of what I'm screening for and speaking about is, getting in really into the weeds around, show me examples of X and Y, and figuring out the right person, not only from a technical perspective, but also from a company culture perspective, understanding, how the business is currently running, how is it funded, what are the timelines, how are the investors, involved, because you've got a really short window and you need to bring in the right person, and they've got to be able to truly hit the ground running. And so that culture fit is equally as important as the technical expertise, because they are going to be immediately integrated, into this leadership team and delivering very high level output.
Is it safe to say, Jeff, that you're looking for senior, experienced leaders? Or do you look at somebody who, as you described, hasn't been a VP yet, but has X, Y, and Z characteristics?
So I think currently and for the past couple of years, we've seen this more so at the leadership level. However, I am seeing trickle down now. So, whereas before it was, a lot of C-suite and, like maybe VP strategic level, I am seeing requests and trickle, or even as we get into projects and we've moved past the strategy and now we're operating these projects, because again, fractional leaders aren't just strategists, they are operators, right? They can do the work, they can lead the work. We're then seeing the need for, when they need support, okay, let's bring in a fractional manager level person, or maybe a fractional level frontline person. Think about a recent supply chain project. And we had the supply chain strategy completely rebuilt, redesigned, but now we needed extra support in like running the POs and tracking the vendors. And, this wasn't a full-time role. So bring in someone who is an expert in that front-facing supply chain, strategy type role, or not even strategy, just supply chain specialist role. I would say more similar almost to a contractor, like a part-time contractor, right? But someone who's done it, they know what they're doing, they can hit the ground running and come in and, okay, we need, 20 hours a week out of this person to make sure that supply chain is running.
You definitely hit the nail on the head there with respect to being very hands-on. If you are a senior leader and you come into an organization as a fractional leader, you have to roll up your sleeves. So the things that you had people that reported to you, these are things that you will be executing. You have to be a doer. You have to really step up to the plate and do the full complement of steps that would be necessary that a team might be executing. And you may be the strategist of the overall initiative, but you have people working for you. If you come into an organization, and I know this based on experience, you come in and like my field is medical affairs, coming in to develop a soup to nuts strategic tactical plan. I'm putting that together, yeah, of course, in a collaborative fashion, and tapping into maybe some third party supporters, but I'm putting the whole thing together and having to present it to executive management, having to get them to buy into the things that I'm recommending in the strategic tactical plan, as opposed to having typical division of I have a operations person who will put the deck together and who will polish it, and then I'll put the final finishing touches on it and present it. You're starting with a blank PowerPoint and putting all the slides together yourself, and really you're it to execute that particular task. Or if you're doing an integrated generation plan, you're working with the cross-functional partners. You're asking them the right questions. You're getting them to help you identify the gaps that need to be filled. And then you go about the task of figuring out how you're going to fill those gaps, and you put the recommendation together and so forth and so on. But it's very hands-on. So when you look for candidates, how do you tease out finding these very experienced or have the technical experience, but maybe not the level experience, who are very hands-on? Because that's a prerequisite for doing this type of work.
Yeah, and so a lot of that will come down to not only total experience, but recent experience. Someone who's working in the, startup to small pharma company is more likely going to have the recent hands-on wearing multiple hat type experience, right? And so I think that someone coming out of a top 10 global pharma where there's just a lot of structure and rightfully so, these are monstrous organizations, and it doesn't diminish that person's ability to manage at a global scale, but it's a different skill set and be able to get on and get into the systems or pull out the project plans, first person, frontline. So it's some of it's just finding the right level of person.
I think you're spot on. I think looking for somebody who has a diverse experience of, like, in my space, big pharma, medium pharma, and startup. You're spot on with startup. You've got to do a lot of different things, because typically when you begin in a startup and you're ahead of something, they start with you, and then you start building it out, doing all the things that you eventually will have others do. And that's a really good indicator of somebody who has that ability to roll up their sleeves and wear those multiple hats, because that's what a fractional contributor needs to bring to the table: the ability to do it all and to ask for help appropriately, but not excessively, because they brought you in to execute it, right?
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. But I think there's a lot to be said about someone who has worked, as an operator, because when they're building that strategy, they're thinking about it through the lens of, well, can it actually be done? So, when you think about a workforce or any individual, you've got a potential line, you've got a performance line, so you have the potential to get this done, have to the performance level, but then also, like, what is bandwidth?
Yeah.
Right. And that's a huge piece. So understanding from that strategic oversight level, okay, we need X, Y, and Z, but is it realistic that can be done by one person? Or as I'm building this strategy out, really thinking about budget and head counting and around to protect runway, are we building a strategy that the current team can fulfill on? And if not, how do we add in? How do we, bring in a partner? How do we outsource? Whatever it may be. Someone who's, recently been hands-on in operations is going to have a much clearer view on the realities of that work.
Fractional is the kind of the buzzword today, but this is not new. This is just a different term for something that a lot of companies have been using for years and years and years. It just so happens to have really accelerated given the environment pharma and biotech is in right now. One of the practical things about doing this type of work for anyone in the audience who is considering this, either out of necessity or they want to shift from working for a pharmaceutical biotech organization, hang their shingle, and get into the consulting realm and delve into fractional work, it's really, really important to think about the practical aspects of what's required for this. So one of the things that you have to do is, more than likely, and this is certainly what I did, is set up your own consultancy. I set up an LLC. Certain organizations will require that you have professional insurance. Certain organizations will employ, especially in California, they typically work through a third party to bring in contractors or fractional leaders. And there's a whole set of things that you have to provide before you get the go ahead to move forward with an organization in a fractional capacity. And one of those is having professional and liability insurance. So there, these are things that are done, but and can easily be done.
Right.
It's things that if you've spent your whole career in pharma or in biotech, it's a real eye opener. It certainly was for me. It's running a business and, it requires that you keep track of your hours. It requires that you have to develop invoices, contracts. If you're doing pure consulting work, every company wants to or needs to, and it's in certainly your best interest to establish a mutually agreed upon and legal contract. Certain organizations will also require a detailed background check, especially if you're working with if the company is working through a third party from an HR perspective. They will thoroughly vet you out to make sure that everything that you say in your resume or your LinkedIn profile is exactly what your experience has been. With the background check, there's a lot of tax implications as well. You're typically going to be a 1099 type of employee, and that means you will not be getting benefits. That's the nature of fractional contract work and so forth. But if you structure your hourly rate commensurate with your level of experience, and that rate is agreed upon by the company, it can make up for the lack of benefit. So there's just a number of very practical things to consider. One of the things that I did, Jeff, when I delved into it, and I actually need to take a step back. After I got downsized, I was very fortunate to have been approached by a couple of CEOs who wanted to tap into my expertise. This is even before I formed the consulting company. So I quickly learned, because throughout my career, I've dealt with contractual things and lawyers, working a contract up that's mutually agreeable and beneficial, and then really setting the stage for how you're going to work with these companies. So I very quickly, and I consider myself fortunate that I didn't have to prospect for consulting work, at least initially. And then those things led to other types of opportunities. And of course, during this whole time, I'm trying to look for a full-time gig like I had in my last pharma role. But it really opened my eyes to the things that I didn't have experience with. Yeah, I had the technical experience to do this type of work, but there's other things you have to be mindful of uh, before you can do the work. I'm sure there are other things that you've advised candidates who've delved into fractional work besides the contractor, besides a 1099 approach to compensation. Figuring out what your hourly rate is.
Right.
Professional insurance, liability insurance is something a lot of companies will require before you are brought on board.
There's all these little steps. None of them are these giant hurdles, right?
No, they're not hurdles. They're just
But they're realities.
the realities. All I have to do.
A price tag. So in California, if you form an LLC, you file for that, and then there's like the franchise trade board. You're compliant with that. You're paying taxes up front. As an LLC in California, at least for year 2025, right? There's like an $800 minimum tax. So even if you're zero on revenue, that's going to be your minimum threshold, and you've got 90 days to pay that. You want to figure out what your income and revenue is going to look like, and if possible, set up like an S corp, right? And there's other ways to, so you're because there's all these other tax implications now that you're dealing with. You don't have an employer picking up the employer
That's right.
portion. You've got that extra,
That's right.
that extra 7.5%.
It's so interesting you bring up the S corp, because that's how I established my LLC. And as a consequence of being an S corp, you have to quarterly report,
Mhm.
and then you have to. So then the accountant comes into the equation. Something maybe you had personally, but now you have to take a business approach to accounting. One of the things that was very helpful for me, because I was a novice to the consulting realm. I always knew that I wanted to become a consultant at some later stage of my career. I wasn't anticipating I'd be forced into it with my first downsizing in 2024. And the getting involved with a group of like-minded consultants has just really been from an information and coming up to speed about the intricacies of doing this type of work has been so helpful. And there are specific consultant groups who are very diversified. They're not just medical affairs or supply chain. There may be commercial consultants or financial consultants or nutraceutical consultants, or just you name it. All these different types of consultants, and coming together. This is what's worked for me. This is what I did in this situation. That's how I found my lawyer for contracts. That's how I found. I had to find a corporate lawyer. I had a regular lawyer. I had to find a corporate lawyer for a different type of opportunity, and it had to be somebody in certain states. So working with a regulatory consultant within that consulting group just opened up all these possibilities that I had never thought of. And I quickly got answers to things that I needed to have practical solutions. Anyone who is considering becoming a fractional contributor or a fractional leader, you'll learn a lot by joining a like-minded consultant group and it's a great networking opportunity too. I don't know if there's anything like that from a recruiting perspective.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, just same as there's multiple, there are recruiting specific organizations, but there's also just general fractional or consulting based organizations. And you do, once you kind of dip your toe in the water, you see like there's this whole world out there, so many people working in it,
Yeah.
both in and outside of life sciences. But, for me, I'd always been familiar because so much of my work over the year has been working, on consulting and contract workforce. And so, whether working, hiring people who were W-2 contractors or 1099s, understanding kind of the complexities of that, but then doing it for myself. And, looking at, again, legalities, the taxation, the sales, the marketing, technology stack, right? There's a million things you can be using out there for all of these, right? And
Right.
you can quickly add up, a giant software stack that's costing you thousands of dollars a month, and then you're not sure what you're using and what you're not, right?
Or you have time to figure out how to
Yeah.
use it. Exactly. You got to be
It's,
practical.
You got to be practical. I got to figure out kind of, I think the barrier to entry, or the kind of like the easiest, simplest way to be effective to
Right.
start, right? And just stay really focused and like, what is your, what are you coming out of the gate with? What is your offering? Where do you shine?
Right.
For you, you were lucky, or fortunate in the fact, it's not luck because you built a career around it, but fortunate in the fact you had this network that was ready to kind of feed you as a consultant, right? So I think, for someone who's considering, fractional work or consulting work in general, if you're a full-time employee and you haven't done this yet, I wouldn't say don't quit. Don't quit your day job,
Right.
right? Test the waters, pick up some side projects, get a feel for it, make sure you like it, and then make sure it can sustain you, financially.
Right.
If you're on the other side of the coin where you've been downsized and you've already kind of faced that hurdle, then, in a sense, the Band-Aid's been ripped off, and this can be a good way to go. But you're going to want to lean into your network. You're going to want to figure out really quickly, what is your offering? Where does it make the most sense for people to engage with you? don't try to be all things to all people, right?
Yeah. What is your unique sustainable advantage? What is your net present value?
And I would say too, and I think you've learned this, and I've heard it, through our conversations the past year is it's not always the first thing you think of, right? So I think the important thing is getting out there and having conversations and meeting people and putting your offer out there, and you'll get the market feedback. If you're getting a lot of no's and no one's interested in what you're offering, ask why, right? And it might be a little tweak, or it might be you're thinking of things through one lens, but a buyer's looking at through another. And so I've seen you go through these iterations of, I mean, you've got your hands in so many pots right now, but that's all been because you've been active out there. You've been having the conversations, you've been doing the networking, and you've been kind of seizing opportunities as they come. And that's been out really well for you.
I've been fortunate. And quite frankly, I haven't used the Jeff Barron method of business development yet, that you have articulated how many people you reach out to on a daily basis and so forth, because I luckily got busy just purely through networking. But Jeff, there's a kind of a true and tried method on a number of different fronts of how to engage, like in my case, the medical community, to increase your odds of finding additional fractional work or additional consulting business. And how would you describe it in a nutshell?
Well, I really do think it varies person to person. So like for you, you're having a strong network, continuing to lean into that own network is your best course of action. It's, the lowest hanging fruit. It's also going to be the most likely to close. It's going to be the quickest to turn into, work and revenue. So, you going to kind of like a cold outbound approach probably doesn't make a lot of sense right now. It's only going to take away from your billable hours, right?
Right.
For someone who's maybe starting out and doesn't have a network to lean into immediately as far as a paying network, putting yourself out there, having conversations, reaching out to peers, former colleagues, leaning into networks like LinkedIn, anyone really you've worked with at any capacity, and just speaking and saying, here's what I'm doing now. They don't even have to be someone who could potentially use your service. It gives you an opportunity to kind of speak out loud, what is your value proposition, putting out in the world, what you're doing, and just having those conversations again and again. There's a kind of like that ripple effect that happens in just networking in general. But B, you'll start honing things and figuring out what's resonating with people. And as you're, it's a pretty safe place, right? With like a former colleague or someone who you work closely with, and they can ask questions like, oh, well, what about this? Or I don't understand this. And it can give you a lot of insight as to how the open market is going
Right.
to react to you.
Completely agree with everything you said, Jeff. And building on what you said, if there's somebody out there who is doing it, and that kind of is mentoring you on how to get into this type of work, ask them. Be so bold as to ask them, if you get to a point where you're saturated with work, given that, like, just say in this hypothetical situation, you have the experience of doing certain things that they are doing, that if that person who is being your mentor needs some additional help, they could subcontract it to you.
Mm-hmm.
You would help your mentor, and that gives you the experience of how you go about the process of doing this type of work. And then your mentor could be subcontracting your first book of business in this capacity. So I really like your comment about really taking advantage of your network. And quite frankly, that's been my experience. It's been through my network, people reaching out to me who have seen what I've done. They'd have me do an ad board, or they would have me tap into my network to try to expand their medical communications business. That is definitely probably the soundest way to really dip your toe into this type of work is through your network. Another thing, when you do this type of work, it's really important to be humble. It's really important to be, yes, I will do that. I can do this in this amount of time. And you should be able to articulate how long things will take. And the more efficient you are, the more your plate will expand. And then the more they will see the value that you bring to the organization. And in one of my situations where I was brought in to be a fractional head of Med Affairs, there were very specific projects. The things that I was doing were working up to the point of potential conversion into a full-time position.
Yeah.
Okay. And that was the dialogue I was having with the CMO. So you can look at fractional work as a stepping stone to getting back into a full-time job as well, where they are testing you out. You're that much farther ahead. They have a comfort with you. You've demonstrated the value. You've completed the projects. You've provided additional value. They've given you additional things to work on, and they're going, well, of course, we need to bring you on. Now, in my case, and this is a testament to how challenging the environment has been lately, that company unfortunately ran out of money. And there was a significant downsizing. As you know, contractors are the first to go in a unfortunate situation like that. And unfortunately, the CMO had to go too in that situation. So you can think about this work either as your next full-time job or as a stepping stone is my point. It can really pave the way to other things. And where I'm at right now is I've done these things over the last year and a half, and I'm very fortunate to be back to a full-time role, but it's actually an advisory services role. I'm now the executive vice president of advisory services for Propel Health Medical Affairs, and that is a consultancy advisory type of role. It's a full-time role, but I have opportunities to provide perspective to companies on the things that they should seriously consider doing. And there's also the opportunity of leveraging my experience in a fractional capacity as well. So once you get into it, you just never know where it's going to lead.
That's great. And I think you've touched on a lot of really important points. So in being around, contracting and consulting for so long, that's one of the things I've always seen as the value is the ability to go in and work with different organizations, different leadership teams. And, as opposed to one long career in one organization, which has its own value, someone who is coming in and solving problems here and there is getting a broader experience, right? Because you're working through different problems, different markets, different leadership teams. And so it makes you more nimble. It creates more opportunity. I love what you said about, the potential for being offered full-time work, because that is something we see pretty often with the fractional, leadership roles. Because at the end of the day, the only reason they're going fractional is because they don't have a budget for full-time. Right. So once they do, if the fractional person's doing a good job and is open to it, that they're certainly the first one to get the invitation to say, hey, would you come on board full-time? And then maybe something you want to do, or you maybe want to continue, your fractional consulting work. But again, it provides that level of opportunity. I think there's just a lot of upside with it. And, as a professional, you grow a lot, not only in your skill set as a strategist or an operator, but then just also as a business person in general. And I think that's huge, and then just understanding almost from a different angle.
Yeah.
And investment and people and talent and just all of the inner workings of what it takes to make a work machine thrive.
I love what you just said, because I didn't really truly realize that I had this penchant for business. I'm a scientist, a medical affairs professional. And as a medical affairs professional, business, you kind of keep that at arm's length because it's about the science compliance is absolutely critical in everything that you do as a medical affairs professional. But there's something about doing your own thing, and it gives you a little bit more room to go in different directions, like you said. And it also gives you the autonomy and you're in the driver's seat of your career. You decide, whether you're going to do this or not, as opposed to, working for an employer. My experience has always been I really enjoy working in a corporate office, working, for somebody and so forth. But this has really expanded my perspective on the art of the possible of different ways of leveraging my skills and experience. And, being a sole proprietor is something you certainly have done for the majority of your career. I've dipped my toe into it, and it's really opened my eyes.
There's a lot to be gained from it,
Yeah.
and I think a lot that can then be turned and put back into, even if you go back in house,
Yeah.
in an organization. I think even from running a budget to thinking of now having the viewpoint of what you've been able to do as a fractional professional, fractional leader. If you are now in house and you're running a team, you can think about problem solving from that fractional perspective, and that I can bring someone else like me in.
Exactly.
So it's just it's understanding that tool set and that kind of solution offering, from the inside, and truly knowing the value and how to really kind of like how to wield that tool.